an isolated incident on that day. It's a threat that's been brewing for centuries, made more powerful by a perfect storm of far-right fear-mongering, internet communities, an influx of immigrants, BLM demonstrations, and a country that is no longer as Christian or as white as it once was, posing a perceived existential threat for those who believe in the United States as a white Christian nation ordained by God. Where did this idea come from, and how did we get here? How is this fringe idea suddenly mainstream? What role does religion play in a country where there's supposed to be a wall between church and state? And is democracy really at stake here? When I set out to find answers to these questions, what I found was complicated, with deep roots in our history as a nation, and only made worse by the current problems this country is facing. This is how the religious right ruined everything. Roll the intro. One sec. Before we dive in, let's get some definitions out of the way, because these groups of people that I'm talking about fall into categories that are hard to define. The religious right is a political movement in the United States that's made up of activists, scholars, lawyers, and politicians that advocate and push for social and political conservatism. Generally, people who are part of the religious right are Christians, but they come from a wide variety of denominations. Evangelicals are a multi-denominational group of Christians made up of Reformed, Holiness, Anabaptist, Pentecostal, Charismatic, and other Protestant traditions. According to the National Association of Evangelicals, their central beliefs include the belief that lives need to be transformed through a born-again experience and a lifelong process of following Jesus, the expression and demonstration of the gospel in missionary and social reform efforts, a high regard for and obedience to the Bible as the ultimate authority, and a stress on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross as making possible the redemption of humanity. As many as 30 to 35% of Americans identify as evangelical, either culturally or actively practicing. Fundamentalist Christians are a group of people within the evangelicals that adheres to a literal interpretation of the Bible and enacts a strict code of conduct for its church members. White Christian nationalists are a group of people who believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and has been ordained by God to be a central force on earth, and like the Israelites, they came to America and took land that was rightfully theirs from the natives. That white people got here first and therefore deserve rights that other people, especially non-white immigrants, don't, and that it is their divine right and duty to fight, as Jesus did in the book of Revelation, ultimately battling in a bloody holy war against the treacherous forces of the Antichrist to take back the United States.
Can I say something without anyone getting mad? Just play D&D at that point. Just play a paladin, man. Just fucking, you can fulfill all these dreams, all these wishes. Just, LMAO, true. I was gonna say, this reminds me of Baldur's Gate. This is really, yeah, like, you know? And the cool thing about D&D is that the gods will actually talk to you. Like, the gods are, like, very, very, very real and very, very, very interactive in the universe, you know? In, like, the D&D universe. Like, you can just, like, if you're playing, like, a cleric, you can just be like, Gog, dear God, please, can I have healing powers? Please. And then they just bestow you with that, you know? So like just play D&D at that point and feel like you're fantasizing about some holy war that's gonna happen in the US. Like, oh my God. Lay on these hands. Lay on these hands. Sussy. I'm literally playing Paladin right now. Dude, Paladin Oathbreaker in Baldur's is fucking, it's S tier, man. Please, Jesus, keep me safe, please. One of your party members fucked one. Yeah, gods in the real world are giga lame. The fact that God doesn't talk back, but in D&D they do, so fucked up, dude. They're just LARPing as paladins and clerics. I know, right?
White Christian nationalists are evangelicals, but not all evangelicals are white Christian nationalists, and not all white Christian nationalists are evangelicals. White Christian nationalism has been around for centuries. It allowed the Puritans to sleep at night as they stole land from natives. It allowed slaveholders to sleep at night believing that owning humans was their divine right, and so on. But it's impossible to unpack the role that white Christian nationalism has played in this country without first unpacking the role that religion has played in this country, especially the role of religion in politics politics and government. Because this thing goes from the shanties in Appalachia all the way to the tippity top, my friends. Let's just start with the 20th century, because going all the way back would require a feature-length film. But if you want that information, you can find it in my research notes linked in my Patreon. As immigrants flocked to the US during the turn of the 20th century, urban slums proliferated, promoting the use of sweatshops and creating poverty, disease, and overcrowding for immigrants. A group of Christians known as the Social Gospel Movement determined that the best way to change this would be to put their religious beliefs into practice and take it upon themselves to right society's wrongs. Around the same time, the temperance movement was championed in the late 1800s by evangelical Protestant reformers, especially women. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in 1874. Galvanizing women around alcoholism as a family issue and uniting women across class and race. Their dreams came to fruition 50 years later through the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, which prohibited the sale, manufacture, and transport of alcohol, except, importantly, for churches, of course. The 1920s also saw the popularization of the radio, and you know evangelists were quick to adopt that technology. Sister Amy McPherson was the first conservative Christian celebrity. Using the newly popularized radio, Sister Amy basically invented the concept of televangelism and ushered in the age of the megachurch. Other popular Christian radio personalities at the time included Billy Sunday and Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin, who used his weekly radio program to criticize the president and promote anti-Semitism. Back then, the church saw him as an embarrassment and eventually silenced him. Today, he would probably get a primetime show on Fox. Then in 1925, a Tennessee biology teacher named John Scopes was found guilty of violating a state law that banned the teaching of Darwinian evolution in the classroom. That verdict was upheld by the Supreme Court. Despite the fact that this was technically a win for evangelicals, members of the national press made a mockery of fundamentalists for their conservative interpretation of the Bible, causing many conservative Protestants to retreat from the public sphere and remove themselves from national politics altogether, taking an isolationist stance for the next several decades and quietly organizing behind the scenes. In the 1930s and 40s, evangelical leaders began forging close ties with economically conservative businessmen with shared objections to political and theological liberalism and mainstream Christian leaders in the National Council of Churches. So they built a network of colleges, parachurch org, radio and television stations, and political action networks that combined Christian values, Jeffersonian democracy, aka belief in a limited federal government, and free market economics, creating a tie between evangelicals and wealthy corporations that exists to this day. After World War II, Americans flocked to church in record numbers. Church building increased and Bible sales were through the roof. And through propaganda in advertising, film, and public addresses, the government, working in tandem with religious leaders, connected communism with godlessness and atheism, differentiating it from the piety of democracy-loving Americans. This ushered in an era of using communism as a scapegoat for the threats of atheism and amorality. Anything that didn't fit the status quo was dangerous, suspect, and probably communist. See my video on communism for a deeper dive. In 1947, the Supreme Court solidified into law the idea of the separation between church and state. The separation of church and state, contrary to popular belief, appears nowhere in the Constitution. The First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, but it does not explicitly say there must be a separation of church and state. This idea comes from Thomas Jefferson, who interpreted the Free Exercise Clause to guarantee a wall of separation between church and state. The fact that Jefferson, one of the framers of the Constitution, wrote these words is strong evidence that the intent of the Constitution was to create separation between church and state. But it's not.
Wait, you mean to tell me that the people who left Britain because they were tired of dealing with monarchy that was inherently reliant on a divine right to rule? You mean those people wanted a separation between the church and the state? No fucking way. No way. But we've always been a Christian nation. That's true. Kangal, thank you so much for the 10 months. Thank you. Naomi, thank you so much for the 5 gift subs. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Not explicitly written into the Constitution, and is therefore a bit more tenuous than I think the average American thinks. In 1947, in Everson v. Board of Education, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "The establishment of religion clause in the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government may set up a church. Neither can pass laws that aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force a person to go or to remain away from church against his will, or force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion. In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. By the 1950s, fissures started showing between evangelicals and fundamentalists within the conservative Christian movement. Fundamentalists maintained that separation from mainstream popular culture and a position against secular society was best, while evangelicals argued that Christians had to engage and participate in the outside culture in order to set the world right and save the non-believers. So they embraced mainstream media, radio, and engaging with the larger culture, which was further strengthened in the 1950s when radio evangelists made the switch to television, with the weekly television show Cathedral of Tomorrow, hosted by Rex Humbard, ushering in a new era of evangelism. Mainstream churches began to see a decline in enrollment in the 1960s, while evangelical churches thrived from the 50s into the 21st century. This is in part due to backlash from the civil rights movement, a movement in which many churches and church leaders were involved in the push for equality, creating a divide between mainstream denominations and the conservative Protestant evangelicals who were threatened by the civil rights movement. Evangelical dismay of change and this perceived disorder was exemplified by evangelical preacher Billy Graham's cozy relationship with Nixon, spurred by Nixon's promises to bring law and order to an increasingly chaotic and sinful world. A series of blows from the Supreme Court during the 60s and 70s also helped to galvanize evangelicals into political action. In the early 60s, New York state law recommended an official, non-denominational prayer for school children to recite. 5 families sued a school district in a Long Island suburb, and when it made its way to the Supreme Court in 1962, in a case called Engel v. Vitale, the court ruled that the prayer violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which Justice Hugo Black, once again writing for the majority, saying, "It is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as a part of a religious program carried on by government."
The only religious rights that you have in the US is that you can practice any religion you want, and if you can be afforded religious exemptions for things, you should be afforded religious exemptions for things. For example, there was a court case in which, I wouldn't be able to remember all the details, but there was a court case in which a woman who was on unemployment benefits was offered a position or a job where she would have had to work Sundays. And she turned the job down because she's Christian and she didn't want to work on Sundays. She wanted to go to church on Sundays. And the state removed her benefits, or I believe that they threatened to remove her benefits. Because they were like, no, you have to, by state law, accept the first position that you were offered. Otherwise, you lose unemployment benefits. And she argued in court, and she won in court, that if you want to be able to practice religion on certain days, you should be allowed and able to. Does anyone know this court case? I think it was on the East Coast. I want to say Virginia, but I might be wrong. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I'll try and find it while the video plays, because it's a really cool court case.
According to legal scholars, this school prayer decision was, in its day, the most unpopular decision the Supreme Court had ever made. Which is shocking given that less than a decade earlier, Justice Black had also authored the Korematsu decision, which is today considered one of the worst SCOTUS decisions ever, as it validated the creation of Japanese concentration camps on US soil. But yeah, definitely not allowing a state-imposed prayer in schools is worse. Sure. 1 year later, in Abington School District v. Shemp, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory Bible reading and reciting the Lord's Prayer in schools was unconstitutional, as it violated the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. This, of course, sparked widespread public outrage and intense public scrutiny for one woman at the center of the case, Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was an ardent socialist and founder of American Atheists, who had tried to escape to the Soviet Union for fear of facing persecution in the US for her beliefs. When she was denied entry to the Soviet Union, she enrolled her son in public school in Baltimore. She soon realized that after the Pledge of Allegiance, the students all engaged in prayer, and when she tried to have her son removed from the classroom during prayer time, the school refused. So she pulled her son out of school and sued the school district. Despite the court siding with Madalyn, the public backlash was swift, with Life magazine referring to her as the most hated woman in America. She was later interviewed for Playboy magazine, in which she identified as a militant feminist and said the iconic line, "I'm not saying that all American men are this way, okay? But 9 out of 10 are breast-fixated, wham-bam, thank you ma'am cretins who just don't give a damn about anyone's gratification but their own. Preach, sister. A fully separate video could be made about Madeline, not only for her at times contradictory views and her cultural vilification, but also for her untimely demise.
That's kind of giga-goated, not gonna lie. Yeah, someone linked it in chat. I had also just found it. I was wrong. It was Sabbath on Saturdays. But I will post it. We can go over it. This is an educational stream. See, guys, I'm educational. Oh, Hassan Factory account. Thank you for the 2 gift selfies. Thank you. We will read the primary holding after we read the case. It is Scherber versus Werner. A appellant, a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was discharged by her South Carolina employer because she would not work on Saturday, the Sabbath day of her faith. She was unable to obtain other employment because she would not work on Saturday, and she filed a claim for unemployment compensation benefits under the South Carolina Unemployment Compensation Act, which provides that a claimant is ineligible for benefits if he has failed without good cause to accept available suitable work when offered to him. The state commission denied the appellant's application on the grounds that she would not accept suitable work when offered, and its action was sustained by the state Supreme Court. And then I believe, do you guys want to play? They're both in here. I believe the conclusion on this case was that the free exercise clause prohibits the government from setting unemployment benefits eligibility requirements that such that a person cannot properly observe key religious principles. Obviously, there's like more details. Yeah, under state laws, employers were not allowed to require employees to work on Sunday. So basically, you are not compelled to work on religious days. Religious rights in the US are crazy. You have giga religious rights in the US. This is also how we ended up with employers not being required to discharge or dispatch birth control pills or having insurance cover birth control pills because of religious rights or whatever, which is bullshit, not gonna lie. But yeah. Incredibly happy to not live in South Carolina anymore.
As a person who practices Satanism, at my job I wasn't able to take an extra day for the weekend of July 25th for Unveiling Day. My boss told me that my religion is against God, so I just cursed him. Next vacation he had in Jamaica, it rained 9/10 days he was there. Don't mess with religious beliefs. Hail the Dark One.
Oh my God. Based. Mainly for Christians, though, yes, but there have been instances where this has not been the case. Another notable case was basically the religious right for indigenous people to use peyote, because I believe it was peyote. Let me just double check. Let's put this one in. Also, touching on the topic earlier, you're not allowed to apply for disability and unemployment at the same time because the disability requires you to not be actively looking for work, and unemployment act requires you actively be searching for work. Poggers! I love our country. Yeah, so it is primarily for Christians, but there have been instances where this has not been the case, where it's been upheld for other people. In its second look at the case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting Native Americans from using peyote in their religious rituals does not violate their constitutional right to the free exercise of religion. And I believe that this court case ended up allowing them to use peyote. So, like, peyote is illegal because it's a fucking drug and we're scared of drugs. Was it Oregon versus Smith? Is that one? No, it was not that one. It was something else. I don't remember the name of the case. But was it? Oh, I think it was this one. 1 second. Court cases are poggers, okay? Okay, I'm going to press play while I read this ruling.
1995, her son, and her granddaughter were abducted and murdered by a man whom Madeline had written a scathing article about in American Atheist magazine. Their bodies weren't found until 2001. In 1968, the religious right suffered another Supreme Court blow in Epperson v. Arkansas, which ruled that an Arkansas law banning the teaching of evolution was unconstitutional because it was based solely on the beliefs of fundamentalist Christians. Then in 1971, the landmark case Lemon v. Kurtzman came down, ruling unconstitutional laws in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island that gave direct governmental financial assistance to religious schools. The court laid out a three-part test, now known as the Lemon test, to decide whether a law violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. This is the test you still learn in law school and study for the bar today. The three parts are that the law must have a secular purpose, the law does not have the primary effect of promoting any religious beliefs, and that the law does not excessively entangle religion with government. If it does, then the law is unconstitutional. Then, in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment passed in Congress and was sent to the states to be ratified, which it never was. And in 1973, Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in America. And at that point, the religious right were like, all right, hold the fuck up right there. We've had enough. And it was this series of Supreme Court cases strengthening the separation of church and state in combination with the Equal Rights Amendment, which conservative Christians saw as subverting the will of God, that women take their God-given roles as wife and mother without question. And then Roe v. Wade gave them the galvanizing final blow they needed to start organizing. And Roe v. Wade became a rallying cry to mobilize social and religious conservatives. The final nail in the coffin came with the D.C. Circuit ruling in Green v. Connolly, which held that segregated institutions can't be considered charitable institutions and therefore can't be tax exempt. The ruling was applied to Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist Christian school that banned interracial dating. And the IRS started investigating the school and whether it should keep its tax exempt status because of this forced segregation of the sexes. At this point, the religious right had started solidifying around the idea that they were the victims of persecution from all sides. First, they can't pray in public schools. Next, they can't ban teaching of evolution. Then they strengthened the separation of church and state, and they let women do what they want with their lives and their bodies, and now we can't be outwardly racist? Witch hunt! With any strong cultural swing to the left or right, predictably a backlash comes from the other side, creating the increasingly large gap between the right and left that we see in America today. Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself was known to criticize the Roe v. Wade ruling as coming too soon, that abortion should have been decided by the legislature because of the predictable backlash that would happen if the Supreme Court made the decision for us. And she was right. The Roe v. Wade decision
Hogger, she was right. Love it. Wakanda forever, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I need to get that on like a t-shirt. I need to make merch of that. That's what I need to do. Also, I found the case, chat. The court case. Apparently it was People versus Woody that was overturned, if I'm not mistaken, and the California Supreme Court held that it is, let me see the wording, I want to use the exact wording that they said, ruled that American Indians using peyote and religious rites are not in violation of the state's narcotic laws. So basically, oh, okay, you are using this for some ritual or for some ceremony or whatever that is religious in nature or spiritual in nature. Normally, we do not allow people to use this drug, this narcotic. You guys are allowed to because it's a religious right for you guys. So we give people religious rights, which is very different from religion being in our laws.
combined with all the other perceived wrongs that the religious right had experienced over the last decade, including the civil rights movement forcing them to come face to face with their own racism, came together to be such a strong galvanizing force for the political awakening and mobilization of the religious right that by 1976, Newsweek proclaimed it the Year of the Evangelical. In all of this, the leaders of the religious right movement saw a strong rallying cry around the sanctity of the family. Whether we're talking interracial marriage, gay marriage, abortion, prayer, or Christian values, it can be tied back to the sanctity of the family unit and how that godly unit is being threatened at all sides. By 1979, popular fundamentalist preacher Jerry Falwell launched a new advocacy group, the Moral Majority, at the behest of conservative operatives from the Republican Party. The Moral Majority sought to mobilize evangelical voters around moral issues. In a single year, the Moral Majority had mobilized in 47 states, claiming to communicate regularly with 4 million members. It was the first time that Christian voters mobilized on a national scale and made politics a priority for the church. Through voter mobilization, lobbying, campaign donations, and promoting candidates sympathetic to their cause, the Moral Majority used a full range of political and social tactics that are still used by the religious right today. And the religious right saw the solution to their problems in presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. They believed he was ready to put their social agenda into action. He supported constitutional amendments to ban abortion and reinstate prayer in public schools. And with the support of this energetic voting bloc behind him, Reagan won the presidency, including 2/3 of the evangelical vote. Unfortunately for the evangelicals, Reagan was too busy fucking up the economy and decimating organized labor to pay attention to their little moral issues. And by the end of his second term, they realized that he had let them down. During the Reagan years, the Supreme Court
Just let me go back in time and kill Reagan, dude. Please. Please. America would be so based if not for Reagan.
Fuck Reagan.
God, dude. I can't wait to go to hell and beat the shit out of that guy.
continued to enforce the separation of church and state, finding in 1984 in Lynch v. Donnelly that any government action that appears to endorse or disapprove of a religion is unconstitutional. In 1985, the court ruled that a moment of prayer violates the Lemon Test and is unconstitutional. By the end of the Reagan administration, the Moral Majority disbanded. In 1989, the Christian Coalition was founded, picking up the torch of evangelical political action from the Moral Majority. But this time, instead of focusing on presidential elections, the mission was to organize evangelicals at the grassroots level. At this point, the tide started turning for the religious right. In 1990, a nearly unanimous Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, meant to provide more federal protection for religious exercise. While the act was later found to only apply to federal governmental actions and not to state governments, the act formed the blueprint for 21 individual states to pass their own Religious Freedom Restoration Acts to apply to local government and make it harder for the government to substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. This means that the government can pass a law not related to religion, but the law will be held unconstitutional if it's found to substantially burden a person's exercise of religion. Then in 2001, George W. Bush took office and the religious right once again saw an opportunity. Bush is an evangelical Methodist. He spoke freely of his faith and made promises.
Sorry, guys, but I gotta show you guys this. Back up, back up. Whoa, Chad, fucking personal space, man. Sorry that my chair is in the way so we can't see them, but they're very cute. They're very cute, and they're being very gray. All right, back to the video.
Promises to enact policies advocated for by evangelicals. And this time, he actually followed through. He signed bills forbidding late-term abortions and restricting embryonic stem cell research. He also established the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives within the first few weeks of his presidency. However, then 9/11 happened, and Bush became bogged down in national security concerns and 2 wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, and he failed to push through the biggest parts of the evangelical agenda: constitutional amendments, banning abortion, and gay marriage. So the religious right gets disillusioned with national politics once more, right around the time that Democrat John Kerry loses the election to Bush, and Democrats then become mobilized to change what they saw as a never-ending war and soon economic collapse in the 2008 financial crisis. Enter Obama, the evangelical death wish. He is the first president to acknowledge non-believers in his inaugural address, saying, "We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers." And then, of course, backlash, because that's what happens every time in this country. With the election of Obama came things like Obamacare, new Supreme Court appointments, the legalization of gay marriage at a national level, an influx of immigrants and programs like DACA, our first non-white president, and the perceived further erosion of Christian family values. The religious right was once again feeling persecuted, like they did in the 60s and 70s during the Civil Rights Movement and Supreme Court cases, further establishing a separation between church and state. They were victims of the woke left. Their country was out to get them. And you know what a persecuted group of people needs? A savior. And they found that savior in Donald Trump, a man with no religion